Samuel Holt rode into Sutter's Bend on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, when the sky hung low and gray over the Wyoming high plains, and the wind carried the smell of coming snow from the mountains to the west. He was 47 years old, weathered in the way men became when too many seasons had passed without answers, and he sat his horse with the careful stillness of someone who had learned long ago that hurrying rarely changed what waited at the end of a road. The town spread before him along the new railroad line, a collection of wooden buildings and false fronts and muddy streets that looked like 100 other towns he had ridden through in the past quarter century. A general store with faded lettering, a blacksmith shop sending up thin smoke, a hotel with curtains that had once been white, a saloon called the Dusty Trail with bat-wing doors that creaked in the autumn wind. He had not wanted to come here. For 2.5 decades, Samuel had avoided this corner of Wyoming the way a man might avoid a grave he was not ready to visit. But the letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, forwarded twice before finding him at his ranch outside Laramie, and the official language had left no room for delay. A probate matter required his signature. Old property tied to the Holt name. A formality, the letter said. A simple closing of accounts. He knew better than to believe anything about this place could be simple. The county clerk's office sat at the end of the main street, a narrow building with a sign that needed repainting and windows filmed with dust. Samuel tied his horse to the rail and stood for a moment looking at the door, feeling the old ache open in his chest the way it always did when something forced him to remember. Catherine. Her name moved through him like a cold wind. A quarter century since she had vanished, since the night she had kissed him goodbye and ridden toward the mountain pass with promises to return before the first snow. Since the search parties found nothing but a broken wagon wheel and silence. Since hope turned to ash and then to something harder, something he carried now like a stone in his pocket that he could not put down and could not throw away. No body had ever been found. No grave had ever been dug. In every way that mattered, his wife was still missing. He pushed through the door. The clerk's office smelled of paper and ink, and the particular mustiness of rooms where records were kept longer than anyone remembered why. A young man sat behind the counter, perhaps 28, with ink stains on his fingers and spectacles sliding down his nose. He looked up when Samuel entered, and something flickered across his face too quickly to read. "I am here about a probate matter," Samuel said. "The name is Holt." The young man, whose nameplate identified him as Thomas Finch, fumbled with a stack of files on the desk beside him. "Yes, Mr. Holt, we have been expecting you." He pulled one file from the stack, then seemed to realize he had grabbed the wrong one and quickly tucked it beneath another, but not before Samuel saw the name written on the edge of the folder in faded ink. C. Holt, Catherine's name. After all these years, still attached to paper in this town he had never visited. This place where the official story said she had died on a mountain road before anyone could reach her. Samuel said nothing, but the ache sharpened into something with edges. Thomas Finch found the correct file and opened it with hands that trembled slightly. "The clerk, Mr. Aldrich, is out at the moment. He should return within the hour. If you would like to wait or perhaps come back." There was something in the young man's manner that Samuel recognized. Not the ordinary nervousness of a clerk dealing with a stranger, but something older. He seemed to want to say more, seemed to hover on the edge of some admission. But then his eyes flicked toward the back room, and he swallowed whatever words had been forming. Samuel noticed. He filed it away. "I will return," Samuel said, and he turned and left before the questions in his throat could escape. The Dusty Trail saloon was nearly empty in the middle of the afternoon. A ranch hand sat at one table with eggs gone cold on his plate, staring at nothing. Two men near the windows bent over a deck of cards without enough money between them to make the game serious. Behind the bar, a thick-armed woman polished glasses with a towel that had long ago given up on cleanliness. A piano stood closed in the corner. The air held the mixed smell of wood smoke and old whiskey and bacon grease and dust from the street. Samuel ordered coffee and took a table near the back where he could watch the door. The coffee came in a chipped cup, stronger than he expected and hotter than the stove should have allowed. He wrapped his hands around it and waited for the hour to pass. That was when the girl came out of the back room. She was carrying a tray of cups, moving with the quick, practiced balance of someone accustomed to navigating crowded spaces without brushing shoulders. Young, perhaps 25, with dark hair pinned up carelessly and a face that was plain at first glance, only because it did not ask to be noticed. There was steadiness in her, a worn steadiness, the kind built from long work and small economies, and the knowledge that no one was coming to make things easier. It was not her face that stopped him. It was the silver at her throat. The locket hung just below her collarbone on a narrow chain, catching the dim light from the windows as she turned. It was oval, not round. One side had a faint chased border, a pattern of tiny leaves that most people would never notice unless they had spent hours looking at it, memorizing it, watching it catch the light on a woman's throat for 3 years of marriage, and then dreaming of it for a quarter century after. And near the clasp, there was a tiny flattened place where metal had once struck stone. Samuel's hand hit the table. His chair scraped back. He was on his feet and moving before his mind had finished understanding what his eyes had seen. The young woman looked up. Her expression shifted from professional blankness to startled wariness as this stranger crossed the distance between them with a speed that suggested nothing good. "That locket," Samuel said, and his voice came out lower and rougher than he intended. "Where did you get it?" The tray shifted in her hands. "Excuse me." "That locket." He could hear his own pulse in his ears, could feel the room narrowing down to that single point of silver against her skin. "It belongs to my wife." The saloon went still with the speed of a room that knows trouble by sound before it knows it by sense. The card players looked up. The woman behind the bar stopped polishing. The ranch hand with the cold eggs turned his head and then carefully turned it back, as if deciding he wanted no part of whatever was about to unfold. The young woman stared at Samuel with an expression that had shifted again, from wariness to something harder. Defiance, perhaps, or simply the refusal to be intimidated by a stranger making wild claims. "You are mistaken," she said. "I am not mistaken." She set the tray down on the nearest table with a deliberate motion, as if she needed her hands free. Then she touched the locket at her throat, a small, instinctive gesture that told Samuel more than words could have. She was protective of it. It mattered to her. "I have had this since I was a child," she said. "Then someone lied to you." An older woman at a corner table, one Samuel had barely noticed when he entered, went rigid in her chair. She was perhaps 52, gray hair gathered into a knot beneath a faded bonnet, and her hand tightened around a teacup with enough force to make the porcelain creak. The young woman took one step back, not in retreat but in repositioning, the way someone might step back to get a clearer view of a threat. "My name is Eliza Varden. I work here. I do not know who your wife was, and I do not answer to strange men who walk in making accusations." Samuel looked at her properly then, really looked, and saw that she had more backbone than softness in her. There was wear in her face, but not weakness. She had spent years dealing with men who thought a raised voice entitled them to whatever they wanted. She was not afraid of him, but she also did not know what she was wearing around her neck. "I am Samuel Holt," he said. "My wife's name was Catherine. That locket was hers. I had it made for her in Laramie 12 years before she disappeared. The clasp broke once when she fell crossing Fox Creek during spring flood. I fixed it myself with a file and a hammer. There is a flattened mark near the hinge where the silver took the blow." Eliza's fingers tightened on the locket. Her eyes changed just slightly, as if something she had always believed had suddenly become less certain. At the corner table, the older woman set down her teacup so carefully that the motion itself became a confession. The small click of porcelain against porcelain was the loudest sound in the room. Eliza saw Samuel notice. She turned and looked at the older woman, and something passed between them that Samuel could not read but could feel. "Marta," Eliza said. It was not a question. It was the beginning of one. The older woman did not answer. Samuel stepped closer, though not near enough to crowd Eliza. He kept his voice level because he understood, in the way men understood when they had lived long enough to learn from their mistakes, that shouting would not get him what he needed. "My wife vanished all those years ago," he said. "She was carrying a child. The search parties found nothing. No body, no answers. Just a wagon and snow, and a road that led nowhere." Eliza's face had gone pale beneath the weathering of her skin. "I was told she died on that mountain," Samuel continued, "but no one ever showed me proof. No one ever brought me anything of hers, and now I find her locket, the one she wore every day of our marriage, hanging around the neck of a young woman who claims it has always been hers." He paused, and the pause was heavy enough to fill the entire room. "How old are you?" Eliza's voice came out smaller than it had been. "That is not your concern." "How old?" She hesitated. Then, because not answering had suddenly become worse than answering, she said, 25. Samuel felt the ground shift beneath him. A quarter century since Catherine had vanished, since she had been carrying a child not yet born, and here stood a young woman of exactly that age, wearing the locket that Samuel himself had clasped around his wife's throat on a morning when she had laughed at him for being sentimental. At the corner table, the older woman named Marta rose unsteadily to her feet. "Come with me," she said. Her voice was thin with strain and years and something that sounded very much like fear. "Both of you, this is not a conversation for a public room." Eliza turned on her with sudden sharpness. "Why? What do you know about this?" Marta did not answer. She only looked at Samuel with an expression that told him everything he needed to know about how long the secret had been kept. And then she walked toward the back door of the saloon without waiting to see if they would follow. Marta Jennings lived in two small rooms behind the milliner's shop on the quieter side of town, where windows stayed curtained more from habit than modesty, and every object seemed to have been repaired multiple times or simply never replaced after it broke. The air inside carried the faint smell of starch and cedar and old remedies, as though someone had once tried to keep trouble away by refusing to acknowledge it through the door. Eliza went in first, her shoulders tight with the particular tension of someone who had just learned that the foundation of her life might be cracked. Samuel followed, keeping his distance, carrying the questions he had been asking for 2.5 decades and feeling them grow heavier with every step. Marta moved to the stove and stood there for a moment as if she had forgotten what hands were for. Then she sank into the nearest chair with the exhausted collapse of someone whose last defense had finally failed. "Start with the locket," Eliza said. Her voice was steady in a way that suggested she was holding it steady by force of will. Marta clasped her hands together until the knuckles whitened. "I gave it to you. I know that. When I was small, but you let me believe it had always been mine." Marta gave the smallest nod, and even that small motion seemed to cost her. Eliza's voice stayed level, which made it cut deeper. "Why?" Marta looked at Samuel first, not at Eliza, and that choice of where to direct her eyes was itself an admission. She was more afraid of him than of the girl she had raised, more afraid of what he represented, perhaps, the truth she had been running from for all those years. "No," Eliza said sharply. "Look at me. I am the one who wore it. I am the one you told nothing. So look at me and answer." Marta did. Her eyes were wet, but the tears did not fall. "I hid it first, for years. Then I gave it back." Gave. Samuel asked the question that mattered most. "Why hide it at all?" "Because if anyone saw it when you were small," Marta said, looking at Eliza, "it might have killed you." The words hung in the room like smoke. A board creaked outside the front step. All three of them turned. Marta crossed to the window and lifted the curtain with 2 fingers, just enough to see through. A tall man in a brown coat stood across the street, his hat pulled low, pretending to study the milliner's display. When he noticed the curtain move, he kept walking without ever looking at the door. Marta let the curtain fall and came back to her chair, paler than before. "That is the kind of fear I mean," she said. "It does not stay buried long, even after all these years." Eliza had not moved from her place near the table. Her hand rested on the back of a chair, gripping it hard enough to make the wood creak. "What do you mean, killed me?" "I mean exactly what I said." Samuel set his hat on the table. "Start from the beginning. All of it." Marta drew a breath that shuddered before it steadied. "I worked as a seamstress then, in rooms behind the old church house, mending shirts, making shrouds, whatever came my way. It was a hard winter, hard enough that people stopped asking whether their lives were good and only asked whether they would survive until spring." She paused and something shifted in her face, something older than fear. "I knew your wife before you married her, Mr. Holt. I knew both of you. I came to this territory the same year you did, looking for the same things everyone looked for back then: land, opportunity, a chance to build something that would last. Samuel frowned. I do not remember you. No. Marta's voice carried a weight that Samuel had not expected. You would not. You only ever saw her. The room went very still. I watched you court Catherine Carver, Marta continued. I watched you ride past my window every Sunday, on your way to her father's claim. I watched you marry her in the spring when the wildflowers were blooming on the hillside. And I told myself that what I felt did not matter, because feelings that are not returned are just weather. They pass. Eliza stared at her. The revelation had struck her harder than anything that had come before. You loved him. I loved what I could not have. And I buried it the way women learn to bury things that have no future. Samuel felt something shift in his understanding of the woman before him. She was not simply a frightened bystander who had stumbled into a secret. She was someone who had been watching his life from a distance for decades, carrying feelings he had never known existed. The night Catherine vanished, Marta said, her voice dropping. I heard the news the same as everyone else. Trouble on the mountain road, a broken wagon, snow and rock. I told myself I was sorry for your loss, Samuel. I told myself I felt nothing but sympathy. She looked at her hands. But when the child was brought to me, I knew God or the devil had finally given me what I had wanted. A piece of you, something that belonged to Samuel Holt, placed in my arms to keep. Eliza made a sound, small and wounded. You were wrapped in a torn blanket, Marta said, looking at her now with something that might have been love and might have been grief and was probably both tangled together beyond separation. You were screaming so hard your face had gone red. A man I knew only in passing put you in my arms and said that if I wanted you to live, I was never to use the Holt name. He did not stay. He did not tell me where he had found you, only that people were looking. Who was he? Samuel asked. Marta shook her head. I never knew for certain. He wore a scarf over his chin and left before the church bell struck midnight. But he said one more thing before he vanished into the dark. He said if anything ever went wrong, if anyone came asking questions, I should take you to the old chapel east of town. He said there was something there they would not dare to touch. Eliza frowned. What chapel? The stone one, past the creek. It has been closed for years. The roof fell in a decade ago. Marta shook her head slowly. I never understood what he meant. I told myself it did not matter. Another piece of a story I was never meant to know. Samuel filed this away, another fragment of a puzzle he could not yet see the shape of. But first things had to come first. You said the child was brought to you because someone was looking for her. Who? Marta's answer was slow in coming, as if she had to drag each word up from a place she had sealed away long ago. In the weeks after that night, men came through town asking questions. Quiet men in good coats who said they were looking for a woman who had been in an accident on the mountain road. They said they wanted to help. They said they were concerned about her welfare. But you did not believe them. No, because they asked about a woman, but they searched for something else. They looked in the church. They looked in the boarding houses. They went through the charity boxes and the poor rolls and the birth records at the county office. Samuel felt something cold settle in his chest. They were looking for a child. Yes, and the locket. Marta looked at the silver oval that now rested in Eliza's fingers, no longer around her neck. There was blood on the chain when she was brought to me, and a bit of blue thread caught in the clasp. I knew at once it had been worn by a woman, not packed among belongings. I was afraid that if I opened it, I would see a face that would make the child impossible to hide. So I chose not to know. I hid the locket in a box beneath my floor for 20 years, and when the questions finally stopped, when enough time had passed that I thought the danger was over, I gave it back to her. Eliza looked up. Her voice was rough. You gave me my mother's locket and told me nothing about where it came from. Marta met her eyes, and in her face there was the particular anguish of someone who knew they were guilty but could not have done otherwise. I told myself it was protection. Protection for who? Marta's voice cracked then, and what came out was not defense but confession. For you, and for me. Because every time I looked at you, I saw Samuel. I saw the life I had wanted and never had. And I told myself that raising you was kindness, was duty, was the right thing to do. But the truth is I kept you because you were his. I raised you because it was the closest I would ever come to having something that belonged to Samuel Holt. The room seemed to shrink around this admission. You loved him, Eliza said again. It was not a question anymore. It was an accusation. I loved what I could not have, and I let that love make my choices for me, even when those choices kept you from knowing who you were. Samuel said nothing, but something in his face shifted, and Eliza saw that he had not known. All these years he had not known. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went silent. Then Samuel asked the question that cut through everything else. How old was the child when she was brought to you? Days. No more. Perhaps a week. That was enough. Not proof. Not yet. But enough to make everything else possible. Eliza reached for the chair and sat down slowly, as if the strength that had kept her standing had suddenly found somewhere else to be. She did not speak. She did not cry. She only sat there with her hand on the locket, looking at it as if she had never seen it before. Samuel stood by the window, his back to both women, looking out at the darkening street. He could not look at Eliza yet, could not let himself believe what seemed increasingly impossible to deny. If she was his daughter, then he had lost her twice. Once when Catherine vanished, and again for every day of the past 2.5 decades when she had been here, alive, growing up without knowing his name. Marta spoke again, her voice smaller now, worn thin by the weight of what she was finally admitting. The man in the brown coat, the one who was watching the shop today, he is not the first. Last week, one of Judge Crane's men came through, asking whether you still had any keepsake from infancy. He bought needles he did not need and asked too casually. Samuel turned. Judge Crane. Aldrich Crane. He has been the county judge here for 30 years. He handles all the property matters, the probate cases, the land disputes. Marta paused. And he was the one who signed off on your wife's death certificate, Mr. Holt. Before you were ever notified she had been found. The room seemed to shrink around that sentence. Eliza rose from her chair. Her face had changed again, the grief giving way to something harder. Something that looked like the beginning of resolve. All this time, she said quietly, I thought poverty was just poverty. I thought hard work was just hard work. I did not know my whole life was a room someone else had built to keep me in. Samuel looked at her, and for the first time since he had walked into the saloon, he saw not just a stranger wearing his wife's locket. He saw a young woman who had survived all those years of not knowing who she was, and who was now standing at the edge of finding out. The locket, he said. May I see it? Eliza hesitated. Then she unclasped the chain and placed it in his palm. The metal was warm from her skin. The weight was exactly as he remembered. The chased border, the flattened place near the hinge, the particular way the clasp caught and released. He had held this locket 1,000 times. He had watched Catherine put it on in the morning and take it off at night. He had repaired it with his own hands after the accident at Fox Creek. He turned it over and found the tiny mark he had cut into the back with the point of a harness awl the day after their wedding. Not a letter, not a symbol anyone else would recognize, just a small angled scratch where silver met frame. This is hers, he said. There is no question. Marta closed her eyes. Eliza watched him with an expression he could not read. Samuel opened the locket, and inside he found what he expected. The faded oval portrait he had last seen on a clear morning when his wife had laughed at him for saying the painter made her look too serious. Catherine's face, younger than he could bear to remember, looking out at him from behind yellowed glass. But something else caught his attention. The portrait side sat deeper than it should. The backing had a thickness that did not match the thinness of the locket itself. He turned it under the light and ran his thumb along the inner edge. Near the hinge, not at the obvious seam but inside it, there was the faintest rise in the frame. Marta, he said, needle. She brought him one from a sewing tin, no questions asked. Samuel slid the point gently into the hidden seam and pressed. At first nothing happened. Then the inner backing gave the smallest click, and the portrait side lifted slightly higher than it had before. Inside, behind the likeness of Catherine, lay a second layer of thin folded paper, old enough to have browned, small enough to have gone unnoticed for decades unless someone knew the compartment existed. Marta made a broken sound. I never knew. Neither did I, Samuel said, because Catherine had made this hiding place after he gave her the locket. She had prepared for something. She had expected something might happen that would require her to leave a message in the only place no one would think to look. He withdrew the slip of paper with hands that were steadier than he felt. The paper was fragile, and he understood with sudden clarity that Catherine herself had folded it, had chosen these words, had hidden them here for this exact moment. Eliza watched without speaking. Samuel unfolded the paper carefully, tilting it toward the light from the window. The handwriting was Catherine's. He would have known it anywhere. That fine, compressed script she had learned at her mother's knee. The particular way she crossed her T's and looped her Y's. He read the first line, and the room seemed to fall away around him. If this is opened, then what I feared has come to pass, and the child has lived long enough to choose. He kept reading, and each word struck like a blow. No one is to claim her by blood, by law, or by pity until she has been told the truth in full and allowed to answer in her own name. Do not place her in the hands of any man who says he comes to protect what is mine, unless he first tells her what has been done and what was taken and what price was paid to keep her unseen. Marta had begun to weep silently, tears tracking down a face that had held this secret for all those years. Trust neither the judge's promise nor the doctor's kindness. One wears law like a glove, the other wears mercy like a curtain. If Samuel lives, keep him from the first search. If he comes too soon, he will be turned toward the wrong men and buried beside the truth. Let time do what warning cannot. If he reaches her one day, let it be after the child has years enough to stand under her own will. Samuel stopped. Read it again. A third time, because the first reading had gone through him too violently to settle into understanding. Eliza reached out and took the paper from his hands. He let her. She read it in silence, her lips moving slightly, her face shifting through expressions he could not name. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears. She knew, Eliza said. She knew something was going to happen to her, and she planned for it. Yes, she kept you away on purpose, to protect you. Samuel felt the weight of those words settle into his chest. All those years of searching, all those years of wondering why no one would tell him the truth. And all along, Catherine herself had arranged for him to be kept in the dark because she had not known who could be trusted. There is more, Eliza said. She turned the paper over, and there, in smaller script, was a final line. She read it aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. If danger comes close, go to the old chapel east of town. Under the third step of the cellar stairs, I have hidden what they are looking for. Let no one find it until she is ready to decide what to do with it. Marta stopped crying. She looked up with an expression of dawning horror. I told her, Marta said, years before any of this. She came to me for mending and asked strange questions. Whether silver could be lined twice, whether a child could be kept off county records for a while, whether something could be hidden best in plain sight. I thought she was frightened for reasons that were none of my concern. I did not understand she was preparing. Samuel folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the locket. Then he closed the compartment and handed the locket to Eliza. She took it but did not put it on. She held it in her palm and looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. So my name is not Eliza, she said. Samuel met her eyes. I do not know what name Catherine meant for you, but Eliza is the name you have lived for a quarter century. It belongs to you as much as any name can. She considered this for a moment. Then she nodded once, a small motion that seemed to contain a decision. Then Eliza will stay for now, she said, until I know enough to choose something different. Outside, the wind rose and pressed against the windows. Down the street, Boots passed the house, paused and moved on. The town had begun to listen. Samuel picked up his hat. We need to go to the clerk's office. The file they showed me this afternoon had Catherine's name on it. Whatever they are trying to close with my signature, it is connected to all of this. Eliza tucked the locket into her pocket, hidden from sight. Then she straightened her shoulders and looked at Samuel with an expression that reminded him, painfully, of the woman whose portrait was hidden inside that silver oval. "Then let us find out what they have been hiding," she said. The county clerk's office looked different in the late afternoon light, the shadows longer, the dust motes suspended in the air like witnesses waiting to testify. Thomas Finch was alone behind the counter when Samuel and Eliza entered, and the young man's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, fear, and something that might have been relief. "Mr. Holt," he said, "I was not sure you would return." "I need to see the file," Samuel said. "All of it. Everything connected to Catherine Holt." Thomas hesitated. His eyes moved to Eliza, standing just behind Samuel's shoulder, and something flickered in his face. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. "Some records are archived," he said. "It may take time. Then start now." Thomas rose from his desk and moved toward the back room. Samuel followed and Eliza came after, and no one asked permission because permission was no longer the point. The records room was narrow and dim, lined with shelves bowed by years of county books and boxes of files going back decades. Dust lifted when Thomas pulled down the first ledger, and somewhere above them, a loose shutter kept tapping against its frame. Samuel stood at the work table while Thomas brought down more files. Eliza positioned herself close enough to read, but far enough to watch both men, and Samuel noticed that she had placed herself between the door and the interior of the room. A habit, perhaps. The instinct of someone who had learned to always know where the exit was. The first ledger contained the official accident report. Samuel read it with the cold attention of a man who had heard this version before and had never believed it. Mountain road incident, winter weather conditions, vehicle damage consistent with rockfall and ice. One female passenger presumed dead. No survivors confirmed. Goods lost. Matter unresolved pending further investigation. He turned the page and found what lay beneath the official language. A death entry, written in cleaner handwriting, dated 3 days after the accident report. Cause of death listed as fever compounded by blood loss and exposure. Name of deceased, C. Holt. Identity affirmed by effects. Witness to entry, A. Crane. Samuel's finger stopped on the last line. Affirmed by effects, not by body, not by family identification, by belongings. "What does that mean?" Eliza asked, reading over his shoulder. "It means they used her things to identify her, not her face." Samuel looked at Thomas. "What effects?" Thomas shifted his weight. "I do not know. The original inventory may have been lost or removed," Samuel finished. "What else is in these files?" Thomas brought out another ledger. This one smaller, its binding cracked with age. He opened it with reluctant hands and pointed to an entry Samuel almost missed. A physician's treatment slip, filed separately from the death record. The name line had been scratched out, the original letters buried under heavy ink. Beneath the obliteration, someone had written, "Female patient, no kin present." Samuel read the date and felt his blood go cold. "This treatment entry," he said, "it is dated the day before I was notified she had even been in an accident." Thomas did not deny it. Eliza leaned closer. "So she was being treated here in town while you were still waiting for word that she had disappeared." Samuel set the paper down so carefully that the motion became frightening. "Then whoever was treating her knew she was alive before anyone told me she was dead." Thomas reached for another file, his movements quick with either nervousness or something closer to decision. "This was filed separately," he said. "I found it last week when I was organizing the archives." He pulled out a thin packet tied with string. The seal was old, the wax cracked, but the ink on the outside was still legible. "To be opened only upon signature of primary claimant." Samuel took it. Eliza watched. "What is this?" Thomas spoke carefully, as if measuring each word. "When Judge Crane asked me to prepare your summons, he instructed me to review all files connected to the Holt name. I found this in a drawer that had been locked for as long as I have worked here. The key was in the judge's desk." "You opened a drawer the judge kept locked?" Thomas met his eyes for the first time without flinching. "I have worked in this office for 6 years. I have never questioned what I was asked to do. But last week, when the judge came to review these files himself, he said something I could not forget." "What?" He said, "As long as the cellar stays buried, no one will find anything." Eliza went very still. The cellar? Thomas nodded. At the old chapel east of town. It collapsed years ago. Or that is what people say. Samuel looked at the packet in his hands, then at Thomas. You have been investigating on your own. I have been paying attention. Thomas paused. After 6 years of filing papers that made people disappear from records, I started to wonder where they all went. Before Samuel could respond, the outer door of the office opened. Footsteps crossed the front room, heavy and deliberate, and a voice called out that Samuel did not recognize. Finch? You in back? Thomas straightened quickly, his face going blank with practiced professionalism. Coming, Mr. Hollister. He moved toward the front room, leaving Samuel and Eliza alone with the files. We need to take these, Eliza whispered. I know. They gathered what they could carry, moving quickly but quietly. The treatment slip with the scratched name, the death entry with the wrong date, the sealed packet Thomas had found. Through the doorway, Samuel could hear Thomas speaking with the visitor in the calm tones of a clerk discussing weather or shipping schedules. Buying time. They slipped out the back door and into the alley behind the building. The sun was setting over Sutter's Bend, painting the sky orange and red, and the first evening lamps were being lit in the windows along the main street. Samuel and Eliza walked quickly, but not too quickly, keeping to the shadows. 2 more figures in a town full of people who knew how to avoid being noticed. He is taking a risk, Eliza said. Thomas. Yes. Why would he do that? Samuel thought about the look on the young man's face, the fear that was there at the beginning, and the something else that had replaced it by the end. Because some lies get heavy, Samuel said, and after long enough, even the people carrying them want to set them down. They returned to Marta's rooms as full darkness fell. The papers spread across the table told a story that Samuel had spent all those years not knowing, and each piece of evidence made the story worse. Catherine had been alive after the mountain incident. She had been brought back to Sutter's Bend. She had been treated by a physician who scratched out her name and entered her as an unknown patient without family. And 3 days later, she had been declared dead by a judge who signed off on a burial before her husband was ever told she had been found. The child was born before she died, Samuel said quietly. That is why they were looking so hard, not just for Catherine, for the baby she was carrying. Eliza sat across from him, the locket back around her neck now, hidden beneath her collar. For me. Yes. Marta stood near the stove, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had not touched. And I took you in, she said, not knowing what I was hiding, only knowing it had to stay hidden. Samuel looked at her. You knew more than you are saying. Marta flinched, but did not look away. I knew Catherine had been asking questions before she disappeared. About property lines, about mineral rights, about an accident at a mining claim 10 years before she vanished. What accident? Marta's voice dropped. Her father owned a silver claim in the mountains. A good one. He died in a collapse when she was young. The claim was ruled abandoned and absorbed into county holdings. That was how Judge Crane first acquired property in this region. Samuel felt the pieces beginning to connect. Catherine's father, a mine collapse. Judge Crane. She was investigating her own father's death, he said. She never stopped, Marta replied. She asked me once, years before the mountain road, whether I knew anyone who had worked at the mine. I told her I did not, but I remembered the question because of the way she asked it. Not curious, determined, as if she had been waiting her whole life to ask. Eliza spoke for the first time in several minutes, so she knew something the judge did not want known, and when she got too close, Samuel finished the thought. Someone made her disappear. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Eliza reached across the table and picked up the sealed packet Thomas had given them. Let us see what else they did not want found. She broke the seal. Inside was a single folded document, a delayed instruction written in the formal language of county law, but carrying the weight of something personal underneath. Samuel read it aloud, his voice steady with effort. In the event of my death, disappearance, or incapacity under suspicious circumstances, no settlement or closure of claims attached to my name shall proceed until the following conditions are met. First, notification to my husband, Samuel Holt, must be delayed until such time as any surviving child has reached legal majority. Second, the identifying token placed in safekeeping with my personal effects must be present and accounted for. Third, no signature of release shall be accepted without confirmation that both parties named above are present and informed. He stopped. Read it again. She arranged this, Eliza said quietly, before anything happened to her. She made it so that no one could finish whatever they started until you and I were both here. Both alive, both able to choose. Samuel set the paper down. All those years. They had waited all those years, keeping the files locked, keeping the questions quiet, keeping the child hidden in plain sight. All because Catherine had written this instruction before anyone touched her. And the law, even the law they had been in every other way, could not proceed without his signature. That is why they sent for you, Eliza said. You are the last piece, the one signature they need to close the file. And if I sign, she met his eyes, then they win. Everything she hid stays hidden. Everything she fought for disappears. Samuel looked at the documents spread across the table. The death certificate with the wrong date, the treatment slip with the erased name, the instruction Catherine had written to protect a child who had not yet been born. Then I will not sign, he said. Not until I know everything. Not until everyone who buried her has to answer for it. Eliza nodded once. Good. And they both understood that what came next would be harder than anything that had come before. The next morning, Samuel woke before dawn in the chair by Marta's window, where he had spent the night. His back ached and his eyes felt full of sand. But sleep had brought no rest anyway. In the darkness before the first gray light, he had dreamed of Catherine. And in the dream, she had been trying to tell him something he could not hear. Eliza was already awake, sitting at the table with the documents spread before her, studying them as if she could will new information to appear through concentration alone. She looked up when Samuel stirred. There is a name on the treatment slip, she said, scratched out, but not well enough. Samuel crossed to the table and leaned over her shoulder. She pointed to the physician's line, where a signature had been scrawled beneath the scratched patient name. P. Ward, she read. I asked Marta. She says there is a doctor here named Phineas Ward. He has lived in Sutter's Bend for 40 years. Samuel felt something shift in his chest. The man who signed the treatment slip. And the burial authorization, Eliza added. Same signature. Samuel reached for his hat. Then we need to see him. But first they went to the boarding house on Reed Lane, because the treatment slip had listed that address as the location of care, and because buildings remembered things that people forgot. The house was closed now, the windows shuttered, the front porch sagging where water damage had weakened the boards. But an old woman answered their knock at the house next door, and when Samuel mentioned the name Whitmore, she nodded and pointed down the street. Agnes lives in the cottage at the end, she said. She sold the boarding house years ago, but never moved far. Agnes Whitmore was 72, small and bent, with eyes that had gone cloudy but not blind. She opened her door with the wariness of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors usually brought trouble. Mrs. Whitmore, Samuel said, my name is Samuel Holt. I need to ask you about a patient who stayed in your boarding house long ago, about the time my wife disappeared. Agnes studied him for a long moment. Then her eyes moved to Eliza, standing behind him, and something in her face changed. You had better come inside, she said. The cottage smelled of lavender and dust, and the particular staleness of rooms where windows were rarely open. Agnes settled into a chair by the fire and gestured for them to sit. I wondered when someone would come asking, she said. After all this time, I wondered. Samuel leaned forward. What do you remember? Agnes folded her hands in her lap. Back then, Judge Crane came to me and asked to rent the upstairs room for a week. Said he had a traveler who needed quiet recovery after an accident on the mountain road. He paid well, more than the room was worth. I knew better than to ask questions. Did you see the patient? Once. Agnes paused, her cloudy eyes looking at something far away. The doctor was there, changing the linens. The door opened wider than he meant it to. I saw a woman lying in the bed. Dark hair, pale skin, eyes that were watching everything. Samuel's hands tightened on his knees. What happened? Agnes was quiet for a moment. On the sixth night, I heard a carriage in the street. Late, past midnight. The next morning, the room was empty. Empty how? Agnes looked at him directly. Cleaned. Not tidied, cleaned. The mattress had been turned, the basin replaced, even the curtains had been taken down and burned. I found the ashes in the yard. Eliza spoke. Burned? Men do not clean messes, Agnes said. Women do. And women know the difference between cleaning dirt and cleaning fear. Samuel rose and walked to the window, looking out at the gray morning. What else do you remember? Agnes reached into a basket beside her chair and withdrew a small box. She opened it and pulled out a yellowed slip of paper. I kept this, she said. I do not know why. Perhaps because I knew someday it would matter. She handed it to Samuel. It was an account slip, a list of supplies requested during the patient's stay. Laudanum, cloth, broth, lamp oil. And at the bottom, crossed through but still legible, a single word, childbed. Samuel read it twice. Childbed. The medical term for the period after giving birth. Agnes saw his face change. I did not understand it then, she said. I thought it was a mistake, the wrong entry on the wrong slip. But you understand it, do you not? Samuel handed the slip to Eliza. She read it and went still. She had just given birth, Eliza said quietly. When they brought her here, she had just given birth. Yes, Agnes said. That is what the word means. And then they cleaned the room? Eliza continued. They burned the curtains. They removed every trace that she had ever been there. Yes. Samuel turned back to Agnes. One more question. Where did they take her? Agnes shook her head slowly. I never knew. The carriage went east, toward the old chapel, but beyond that, I could not say. They left Agnes Whitmore's cottage and walked back through town in silence. The morning had brightened, but the air remained cold, carrying the first hint of coming winter. We need to see the doctor, Samuel said. I know. And the chapel. Yes. But before they reached the main street, a figure stepped out of an alley ahead of them. Tall, brown coat, hat pulled low. The same man who had been watching Marta's house the day before. Mr. Holt, the man said. His voice was flat and careful. Judge Crane requests the pleasure of your company. Samuel stopped walking. Eliza moved to his side. The judge can wait. I am afraid he cannot. The man opened his coat slightly, just enough to show the handle of a pistol at his belt. He said to tell you that your business with the county requires immediate attention. Samuel calculated distances, angles, odds. The man was younger and armed. The street was mostly empty. Running would solve nothing. Very well, Samuel said. But the young woman stays here. The man shook his head. The judge was specific. Both of you, Eliza lifted her chin. Then both of us it is. They followed the man through town, past the clerk's office and the general store, past the hotel with its faded curtains, until they reached a large white house at the end of the street, the house of Judge Aldrich Crane. The judge was waiting in his study, a room filled with leather chairs and law books and the particular smell of expensive tobacco. He was in his 60s, silver hair swept back from a face that had grown accustomed to power, and his presence filled the room the way authority fills a courtroom even before the gavel falls. Mr. Holt, Crane said, rising from behind his desk. I had hoped we could handle this matter with dignity. Samuel did not sit when a chair was offered. What matter would that be? The probate, of course. Crane smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his eyes. Your wife's name appears on certain old claims. Your signature is required to close them. A simple formality, Eliza spoke. Is that why you had my mother treated in secret and declared dead before her husband was notified? Crane's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes went cold. Miss Varden, I see you have been asking questions. I have been finding answers, she said. That is different. Crane turned to Samuel. Mr. Holt, I understand that certain discoveries have been made, old records examined, witnesses consulted. I understand the temptation to interpret these findings in the most dramatic way possible, but I urge you to consider the consequences of pursuing this matter further. Samuel's voice was steady. What consequences would those be? The past is a complicated thing, Crane said. People made decisions long ago based on circumstances you cannot fully understand. Some of those decisions may look troubling to modern eyes, but dragging them into the light now will only cause pain. For you, for the young woman, for the entire town. Eliza laughed softly, a sound without humor. You are offering to make this go away. I am offering perspective, Crane said. Your mother was a troubled woman, Miss Varden. She made accusations she could not prove. She pursued grievances that had long been settled. When she died, we did what we could to protect her child from the stigma of her obsessions. Samuel took a step closer to the desk. What obsessions? Crane's expression shifted, and for the first time something darker showed through the careful composure. Catherine Holt believed that her father's death was not an accident, he said. She believed that someone had deliberately caused the mind collapse that killed him. She spent years trying to prove this theory, alienating friends, straining her marriage, placing herself in increasingly dangerous situations. Samuel felt the anger rising in his chest but kept his voice controlled. And you expect me to believe this? I expect you to sign the release, Crane said, and let the dead remain buried. In exchange, I am prepared to offer a substantial settlement to Miss Varden, enough to leave this town and build a new life somewhere that does not carry the weight of old tragedies. Eliza reached into her pocket and withdrew the locket. She opened it, removed the hidden paper, and placed it on Crane's desk. My mother expected you, she said. She knew what you would try to do, and she left instructions. Crane looked at the paper. His face changed, the calm cracking just slightly around the edges. She wrote that no one should trust the judge's promise, Eliza continued. She wrote that someone should find what she hid in the chapel. She wrote that I should know the truth before anyone asked me to decide anything. Crane recovered his composure, but not entirely. That document has no legal standing. It has standing with me, Samuel said, and I will not sign anything until I have seen what she hid. Crane was silent for a long moment. Then he reached for a bell on his desk and rang it. The man in the brown coat appeared in the doorway. Mr. Holt and Miss Varden are leaving, Crane said. Please escort them out. Samuel and Eliza walked back through town under the watchful eyes of the man in the brown coat. He followed them at a distance, not threatening, just present. He will not let us reach the chapel, Eliza said quietly. No, Samuel agreed. Not while he is watching. Then we wait. Yes. They returned to Marta's rooms as darkness began to gather again, and Samuel understood that whatever came next would have to come soon, because men like Crane did not wait long once their control began to slip. That night, Samuel heard the sound that changed everything. He was sitting in the chair by the window, watching the street, when movement caught his eye. A shadow crossing between buildings, a shape moving toward Marta's door. He was on his feet before the first board creaked on the front step. The door burst open. A man rushed through, not the one who had escorted them to Crane's house, but someone bigger, his face covered by a bandana. Samuel met him in the center of the room. They struggled in the darkness, knocking against furniture, sending a lamp crashing to the floor. The man was strong but panicked, grasping at shadows instead of fighting effectively. Samuel caught his arm and twisted, driving him to his knees. Eliza appeared from the back room with a poker from the stove. She held it like a woman who knew how to use it. The man looked from Samuel to Eliza to Marta, who had emerged from her bedroom clutching a shawl. Where is the locket? The man demanded. Samuel pressed harder on the twisted arm. Who sent you? No answer. Samuel increased the pressure. The man gasped. Crane, he said finally. The judge sent me. He said to bring back the locket and any papers you took from the office. Samuel released him with a shove that sent him sprawling. Get out. Tell Crane we are coming for the truth, whether he wants us to or not. The man scrambled to his feet and fled into the night. Eliza lowered the poker. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady. He knows we are close. Yes. We need to go to the chapel now, before he sends someone else. Samuel looked at Marta. Will you be safe here? Marta nodded, though fear was visible in her face. Go. Find what she hid. Finish this. They slipped out the back door and into the darkness. The old chapel stood at the edge of Sutter's Bend, past the creek where the road curved east, and the last of the town lights faded into darkness. It had been abandoned for years. The roof caved in, the walls gray with weather and neglect. But as Samuel and Eliza approached in the moonlight, they could see that the structure still stood, waiting. The front door was swollen shut. Samuel found a side entrance. The wood rotted enough to give way under pressure, and they slipped inside. The interior was a ruin of fallen timbers and broken pews. Moonlight filtered through the collapsed roof, casting strange shadows across what had once been a place of worship. Somewhere a bird shifted in the rafters, but otherwise the silence was complete. "The cellar stairs," Samuel said. Catherine's note mentioned the third step. They found the entrance to the cellar at the back of the building, a wooden hatch half buried under debris. Samuel cleared enough to lift it, and a breath of cold air rose from the darkness below. He went first, testing each step. Eliza followed with a lit match that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. The cellar was smaller than Samuel expected, the ceiling low enough that he had to bend slightly to avoid the beams. Water damage had buckled the walls in places, and the smell of earth and decay was heavy in the air. "Third step," Eliza said. Samuel counted. The third step down was stone, not wood, set into the foundation of the building itself. He knelt and ran his fingers along the edges. "There is a seam," he said. "A gap in the mortar?" Eliza handed him a knife from her pocket. He worked the blade into the crack and pried. The stone shifted. Beneath it, cut into the earth, was a hollow space. Inside the hollow sat a metal box, rusted but intact. Samuel lifted it out and set it on the floor. Eliza struck another match. Samuel opened the box. Inside were papers. Old papers, yellowed with age, covered in handwriting he recognized. Catherine's handwriting. And beneath the papers, other documents, official-looking, with stamps and signatures in the formal language of legal authority. He lifted the first sheet and began to read. 10 minutes later, he understood everything. Catherine had not died on a mountain road. She had not succumbed to fever. She had been murdered, slowly, deliberately, by men who needed her silence. Her father had discovered silver on his claim 30 years ago. Not the ordinary silver that dozens of miners had found in these mountains, but a vein so rich it would have made him one of the wealthiest men in Wyoming. He had filed papers. He had registered the claim. He had told his young daughter about the fortune that would change their lives. And then the mine had collapsed. Official cause, structural failure, natural causes, no one to blame. But Catherine had never believed it. She had spent years gathering evidence, tracking down former workers, piecing together testimony, and what she had found was worse than she had imagined. Aldrich Crane, then a young attorney handling mining claims for the county, had learned of the silver vein. He had approached Catherine's father with an offer to buy the claim. When the offer was refused, he had approached again, more aggressively, and when Thomas Carver, Catherine's father, had laughed at him and called him a vulture circling for scraps in front of the entire county office, Crane had decided that humiliation required an answer. He had arranged for the support timbers in the mine to be weakened. The collapse was not an accident. It was murder dressed as misfortune, and the wound to Crane's pride had festered for 30 years. After her father's death, the claim was ruled abandoned. County procedure, legal formality. The land reverted to county holdings and was quietly absorbed into Crane's expanding empire. Catherine's mother had died shortly after, broken by grief, and young Catherine had been left with nothing but questions and a memory of a promise her father had made about a fortune that should have been hers. She had continued investigating even after she married Samuel, even after she became pregnant. She had found witnesses who would talk, former workers who remembered strange orders in the days before the collapse. She had gathered enough evidence to bring Crane to trial, but someone had warned Crane. The night Catherine disappeared, she had been fleeing, not from an accident on a mountain road, but from men Crane had sent to silence her. They had caught her at the pass. They had taken her documents. But they had not found everything, because Catherine had been smarter than they expected. She had hidden copies in the chapel. She had written instructions in the locket. She had delivered her baby in secret, with the help of a servant who had fled immediately after. And then they had brought her back to Sutter's Bend, to the boarding house on Reed Lane, to a room with a nailed window and a doctor who followed orders. Samuel set down the papers and looked at Eliza. She had been reading over his shoulder. Her face was pale in the matchlight, but her eyes were dry. He killed her father, she said. And then he killed her. Yes, because her father humiliated him, and because she would not stop asking questions. Yes. Eliza picked up the last document in the box. It was a letter, sealed, addressed to Samuel Holt. She handed it to him. He broke the seal with trembling fingers and read, "My love, if you are reading this, then I am gone and our child has survived. I pray she has found her way to you, or you to her, and that what follows will bring justice rather than only grief. I could not tell you what I had discovered. I tried once, but I saw the look on your face and I knew that you would have done something rash, something that would have gotten you killed before you could save either of us. So I chose to fight alone, and I am sorry for that choice every day. What you hold in your hands is proof of what Aldrich Crane did to my father. It is proof of what he has done to me. Use it. Make him answer. And tell our daughter that her mother loved her from the moment she knew she existed, and that every choice I made was to give her a chance at the life that was stolen from me. Do not mourn me forever. Live, Samuel. Live for both of us. Forever yours." Catherine Samuel folded the letter and placed it inside his coat, next to his heart. Eliza was watching him. Her eyes were bright now, not with tears but with something fiercer. "We have what we need," she said. "Yes, then let us finish this." They emerged from the cellar as the first gray light of dawn was breaking over the mountains. The chapel looked different in the morning, less abandoned and more like a monument, a place where truth had waited to be found. As they walked back toward town, Samuel saw a figure approaching from the main road. It was Thomas Finch, the young clerk, and he was running. He stopped when he reached them, breathing hard. "I have been looking for you all night," he said. "The judge called a special session. He is going to file a declaration of abandonment on the Holt claims this morning and transfer everything to county holdings. If he does it before you can present evidence, the whole case will be buried in procedure for years." Samuel showed him the box. "We have evidence." Thomas looked at the papers, at the documents, at the letter. Then he reached into his own coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "So do I," he said. "I went to the chapel myself last night, before you arrived. I found a second hiding place, under a loose stone in the wall. These were inside." He unwrapped the bundle. Inside were more documents, these in Catherine's handwriting, detailing specific witnesses, specific dates, specific acts of sabotage at the mine. Samuel frowned. "How did you know where to look?" Thomas met his eyes. "I heard the judge talking to Dr. Ward last week," he said. "As long as the cellar stays buried, no one will find anything." I decided to find out what he meant. Eliza looked at Thomas with something approaching respect. "Why are you helping us?" Thomas met her eyes. "Because I have worked in that office for 6 years, watching Judge Crane file papers that erase people. I told myself I was just a clerk. I told myself it was not my responsibility, but some lies get too heavy. After a while, even the person carrying them has to set them down." Samuel gathered both sets of documents. "Then let us give the judge something to read." They walked into town together, 3 figures against the morning light, carrying truth that had waited far too long to be spoken. The county courthouse was already occupied when they arrived. Judge Aldrich Crane sat behind his bench, robed and formal, with a stack of papers before him and a self-satisfied expression on his face. In the gallery, a handful of townspeople had gathered, drawn by word that something unusual was happening. Thomas Finch took his position at the clerk's desk. Dr. Phineas Ward sat in the front row, an old man with white hair and steady hands, and eyes that would not meet anyone else's. Samuel walked down the center aisle with Eliza beside him. He stopped before the bench and placed the metal box on the rail. Crane looked at it. His expression did not change. "Mr. Holt," he said, "I was not expecting you this morning." "I am here to present evidence," Samuel said. "Evidence of the murder of Thomas Carver 30 years ago and the murder of his daughter, Catherine Carver Holt." The courtroom went very quiet. Crane's face tightened slightly. "Those are serious accusations." Samuel opened the box and began placing documents on the rail, one by one. Testimony from former mine workers naming the men who weakened the support timbers. Financial records showing payments from Crane's accounts to those same workers in the months before the collapse. Catherine's own notes detailing her investigation and naming Crane as the man who had ordered her father's death. Crane watched without speaking. His face had gone gray. "And this," Samuel said, placing the physician's treatment slip on the rail, "is proof that my wife was alive in this town for 6 days after she was supposedly killed on a mountain road. She was treated in secret at a boarding house. She gave birth to a daughter who was smuggled away to protect her from the men who had already killed her mother's father." He placed Catherine's letter on top of the pile. "And this is her own account, written in her own hand, naming the men responsible and asking that justice be done." Crane reached for the bell on his desk. "This proceeding is." Dr. Ward spoke first. His voice was thin and old and tired. "He is telling the truth." The courtroom turned to look at the old man in the front row. Ward rose slowly to his feet. His hands were not steady anymore. "Long ago, Judge Crane asked me to treat a woman at the Reed Lane boarding house. She had been injured. She had just given birth. She was confused and frightened, but she was not dying." Ward's voice cracked. "I made her die." Crane's face went white. "I increased the sedatives," Ward continued, "night after night. I told myself I was easing her suffering, but the truth is that I was following orders. And when she stopped breathing, I signed the death certificate that called it natural causes." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Thomas Finch was writing furiously. Ward turned to look at Eliza. "I sent money to the woman who raised you," he said, "small amounts over the years. I told myself it was kindness, but it was guilt. Guilt for what I had done to your mother. Guilt for what I had helped bury." Eliza looked at him with an expression Samuel could not read. Crane's voice rose above the noise. "This testimony is inadmissible. This man is clearly—" "You will want to stop talking now," Thomas Finch said quietly. Everyone turned to look at the young clerk. Finch held up a document. "This is the original instruction Catherine Holt left with the county clerk all those years ago, 1 year before she disappeared. It states that any closure of claims attached to her name must be delayed until her husband and any surviving children have been notified and present. It states that the identifying token, the locket, must be accounted for. It states that both parties must give informed consent." He looked at Crane. "You have been trying to close this file for a quarter-century," he said. "You sent for Mr. Holt because you needed his signature, but you never meant for him to find the truth. You never meant for any of this to come out." Crane's composure finally shattered. He stood abruptly, knocking papers from his desk, and what came out was not the desperate denial of a man caught in his crimes. It was something older, something that had festered for 30 years. "Thomas Carver humiliated me," Crane said, his voice raw with decades of buried rage. 30 years ago, when I was nothing but a young attorney trying to build a practice in this territory, I offered to handle his mining claims. A fair arrangement, a professional courtesy. And he laughed at me. In front of the entire county office, he called me a vulture circling for scraps. His hands gripped the edge of his bench. I was nobody then. He made sure everyone knew it. So I waited. I learned. I became someone. And when the opportunity came to take what he would not share, I took it. Samuel's voice was ice. "You killed a man because he wounded your pride. I killed a man who thought he was better than me. And when his daughter started asking questions, when she began digging into records that should have stayed buried, I realized the family would never stop. They had to be ended, all of them." He looked at Eliza. "You were supposed to disappear with her. The fact that you survived is the one mistake I could never correct." The courtroom was utterly silent. Then Thomas Finch spoke again, his voice calm and clear. "Under the provisions of the original instruction," he said, "I am required to offer Miss Holt, known also as Eliza Varden, the opportunity to make her formal claim on the record." He pushed the county ledger toward her and held out a pen. Eliza took the pen. She looked at Samuel for a long moment. Then she bent over the ledger and wrote in clear and careful letters, "Clara Catherine Holt, known in life as Eliza Varden." She set the pen down. The sound was small. The weight was enormous. Samuel looked at the name she had chosen. Clara, which meant bright. Catherine, which had belonged to her mother. Holt, which belonged to him. Crane sat down heavily in his chair. His face had aged a decade in the past hour. Thomas Finch picked up the ledger and examined the signature. "The claim is registered," he said. "The record is corrected, and based on the evidence presented today, I am recommending that the county prosecutor open investigations into the deaths of Thomas Carver and Catherine Carver Holt." He looked at Crane. "I am also recommending that Judge Crane be removed from the bench pending the outcome of those investigations." Crane did not protest. He sat in his chair, staring at the documents on his desk, and said nothing. Dr. Ward was taken into custody that afternoon by the county sheriff, who had been summoned from the next town over because no one in Sutter's Bend could be trusted to handle the matter locally. Ward went quietly. He seemed almost relieved. Judge Crane was removed from his home that evening. He would be held in the county jail until a proper trial could be arranged, which would not be in Sutter's Bend and would not be presided over by anyone he had appointed. The townspeople watched in silence. Some of them had known. Some had suspected. Most had simply kept their eyes down and their mouths shut because that was how survival worked in small places where powerful men held all the cards. Now the cards were on the table, and the game had changed. 1 month later, the cemetery on the eastern edge of Sutter's Bend had been tended for the first time in years. Someone had cleared the weeds from the oldest section, straightened the markers that had tilted with age, and planted late autumn flowers at the base of the stones. Catherine's grave was new. The headstone was simple, carved with her name and the dates of her life in a single line of inscription. She never stopped fighting. Samuel stood before the grave with his hat in his hands. The wind had turned cold in the past week, carrying the first real taste of winter from the mountains. But he did not feel it. Clara, who still answered to Eliza when old habits surfaced, stood beside him. The locket was around her neck again, no longer hidden, no longer a secret. "I spent all those years looking for her," Samuel said quietly, "and she was here all along, waiting for me to find her." Clara did not answer immediately. She was looking at the headstone, at the name that had once belonged to her mother and now connected them across all the years of separation. "She knew you would come," Clara said finally. "She planned for it. She believed in it." Samuel nodded slowly. They stood in silence for a while longer. The wind moved through the bare branches of the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. "What will you do now?" Clara asked. Samuel considered the question. He had come to Sutter's Bend to sign a piece of paper and close a chapter of his life. Instead, he had found a daughter he never knew existed and answers that had been buried for a quarter century. "Go back to the ranch," he said. "There is work that needs doing before winter sets in, but I will return. Often, if you want me to." Clara looked at him. Her eyes were Catherine's eyes, he realized now. The same shape, the same intelligence, the same fierce determination. "I want to know who she was," Clara said, "not just from documents and letters, from someone who loved her." Samuel felt something shift in his chest, not the old ache that had lived there for all those years, but something new, something that might, with time, become healing. "I will tell you everything," he said, "everything I remember." Clara nodded. "Then I will be here." They turned and walked together toward the edge of the cemetery, where the road led back to town. Clara paused at the gate and looked back at the headstone one more time. "I name myself Clara," she said, "because it means bright, because I spent so long in darkness, and I do not want to live there anymore." Samuel put his hand on her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her since they met. "It is a good name," he said. She would have approved. Clara smiled, a small expression that held more pain than joy, but was real nonetheless. Marta Jennings met them at the edge of town. She had aged visibly in the past weeks, as if the release of the truth she had carried for so long had finally allowed her body to feel the weight of the years. She looked at Clara with eyes that held decades of love and guilt and hope. Clara did not embrace her, did not forgive her entirely, but she did not turn away either. "You raised me," Clara said. "That counts for something." Marta wiped her eyes. "I tried to protect you. I know." Clara paused. The love was real, even if it was tangled up in things that had nothing to do with me. "I understand that now." Marta nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I cannot forget what you kept from me," Clara continued, but I can choose what to do with what is left. And I choose to remember that you fed me when I was hungry and held me when I was sick and never once let me believe I was unloved. Marta could not speak. She only nodded again, grateful for even this much grace. They walked together down the main street, past the courthouse where Crane's nameplate had already been removed, past the clerk's office where Thomas Finch was reorganizing records that had been buried for decades, past the Dusty Trail Saloon where Clara had worked for years without knowing who she really was. The locket caught the last light of the setting sun and gleamed against her collar. Her mother's locket, her mother's name, her mother's truth, finally hers. Samuel walked beside her, and though no words were spoken, both of them understood that what had been lost could never fully be recovered. But what remained, what had survived all those years of silence and separation, was enough to build something new. A father and daughter who had found each other too late to share a lifetime, but not too late to share what was left of it. A town that had finally been forced to look at its own reflection and acknowledge what it saw. A woman who had never stopped fighting, even after death, until her voice was finally heard. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the mountains where the snow was already falling, a new season was beginning, cold and hard and honest, like the truth, like justice, like the life that Clara Catherine Holt was finally going to live. The end.